I knew the moment I heard the first cement truck hit my bridge, someone was about to lose a lot more than a shortcut. The low diesel rumble rolled through the trees before I even saw it. A deep mechanical growl that didn't belong anywhere near a 12-foot-wide timber bridge built in 1983. I was standing on my porch, coffee still warm in my hand, when the sound changed. What under stress has a voice? And that morning, it started whispering. Then came the crack. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to tell me everything I needed to know. I didn't move, didn't shout, didn't wave them down. I just stood there and watched 40,000 pounds of rotating concrete crawl across something that had been engineered for less than half that weight. 2 weeks earlier, Linda Whitmore had stood in that exact spot at the end of my driveway, heels clicking against gravel like she owned the ground beneath her. "This little bridge of yours is holding up progress," she said, smiling like it was a compliment. Behind her, I could see the survey flags already planted, bright orange against the green like warning signs nobody else could read. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a licensed civil engineer, third-generation landowner. And that little bridge she was talking about? My grandfather built it with his own hands using county-approved specs and a load rating that I've had memorized since I was 12 years old. 12 tons. That's it. Not a pound more if you care about structural integrity. And I do." What Linda didn't understand, and what she didn't bother to ask, was that everything about that bridge was documented, registered, filed with the county down to the last bolt and beam. The load limit wasn't just a suggestion. It was a legal boundary, a line in the sand backed by paperwork older than her entire subdivision. The first truck rolled across that morning like it had every right to be there, tires grinding against the wooden planks, leaving behind faint gray dust that didn't belong on untreated timber. I could smell it from where I stood. Wet cement, hot engine oil, and something else, arrogance. They didn't even slow down. The driver didn't look left or right, just followed the temporary construction signs Linda's crew had planted at the road, pointing straight through my property like it was public infrastructure. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down on the railing. Then I reached into my pocket and tapped my phone screen. The cameras were already recording. They had been for days. Every axle, every license plate, every ton that crossed that bridge. I'd measured the deflection myself the night before, standing underneath with a flashlight, running calculations in my head while the creek moved quietly beneath my boots. I knew exactly how much it could take, and exactly what would happen when it didn't. You can probably guess what most people would do in that situation. Call the cops, block the road, start a fight. I didn't do any of that, because sometimes the smartest move isn't to stop someone from making a mistake. It's to let them make it on record. I bought this land for one reason that most people never understand until it is too late. Control. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs signs or fences every 10 feet. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in paperwork, in measurements, in lines on a map that nobody pays attention to until they cross them. 47 acres just outside county limits. Rolling ground. One access point, and that bridge. Everything in or out had to pass over those 12 feet of treated timber and steel bolts that had been holding steady for 4 decades. My grandfather used to say, "If you control the crossing, you control everything on both sides." I did not fully appreciate what he meant until I came back from my last project out in Colorado and found survey stakes creeping closer to my property line like they were testing how much I would tolerate. At first it was small things. A crew parked too close. A temporary sign placed just a few feet onto my side. Then came the meetings. Not with me. Around me. I heard about them from a neighbor down the road. A retired guy who notices everything and forgets nothing. He told me the HOA had been pitching a development expansion, something about improving access for emergency vehicles and increasing property values. That is always how they phrase it. Improvement. Progress. Words that sound clean until you look at what they are actually planning to run over. I pulled the county records that same night. The smell of old paper and toner filled the clerk's office while I stood there flipping through documents that most people would never think to read. Permits, zoning adjustments, preliminary route proposals. And there it was, faint but unmistakable. A projected access line cutting straight through my bridge. Not around it, through it, like it was already theirs. I remember running my thumb along the edge of that page, feeling the slight indentation where it had been printed, and thinking how easy it is for someone to redraw reality if nobody pushes back. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like an engineer again. Numbers, limits, liability. I went home and pulled my original bridge file from the cabinet in my workshop. The folder was thick, worn at the edges, every inspection report neatly stacked, every load calculation signed and stamped. 12 tons maximum. Clearly posted. Legally recorded. I checked the signage the next morning. Still there. Faded a little, but readable. More importantly, enforceable. That is when the plan started forming, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I was not going to argue with Linda. I was not going to stand in front of a truck and try to stop it with my hands. That is not how you win against people who think rules are suggestions. You let the rules do exactly what they are designed to do. You let them apply pressure quietly, consistently, until something gives. I spent the next few days installing sensors beneath the bridge, small load monitors tucked up against the main support beams, calibrated down to the pound. Nothing flashy. Nothing visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The kind of setup I used on job sites when millions of dollars depended on knowing exactly when a structure was being pushed too far. I synced everything to my phone, watched the baseline readings settle into place, steady and predictable like a heartbeat. Then I waited, because I knew they would not ask. People like Linda never do. They assume access. They assume authority. And sooner or later, they assume wrong. The second truck hit heavier than the first, and this time the bridge did not whisper, it answered. A low, drawn-out creak rolled up through the support beams and into the planks under those tires, like the whole structure was taking a slow breath it could not afford to finish. I watched the live feed on my phone, numbers ticking upward in clean, precise increments. 8 tons. 9. 10. The baseline I had logged days earlier stayed steady, but the peaks were starting to stretch higher with every axle that crossed. That was the thing about load. It does not lie. It does not care about intentions or meetings or what someone thinks they are entitled to. It just accumulates until something changes. By mid-morning, the pattern was clear. They were not testing the bridge. They were using it. Fully. Confidently. Like it had always been part of their plan. I could hear the rhythm, now even without looking. Engine rumble, tire crunch, that half-second of silence in the center span, then the soft strain of wood adjusting under weight it was never meant to carry. Over and over again. A system forming where there should have been none. Around noon, I saw her again. Linda Whitmore stepped out of a white SUV parked just off the main road, clipboard in hand, sunglasses catching the light like she was inspecting a job site she owned. She did not walk up to my house. She did not knock. She stood near the entrance, pointing, directing, talking to a man in a hard hat who nodded like everything about this made perfect sense. I zoomed in on the camera feed, catching the angle of her hand as she gestured toward the bridge, casual, dismissive, like it was nothing more than a patch of asphalt. That small movement told me everything. This was not a mistake. This was a decision. I set my phone down and walked out to the edge of my property line, stopping just short of where the gravel turned to packed dirt. The air carried that mix of diesel exhaust and wet concrete again, thick enough that I could taste it. One of the drivers slowed slightly as he approached, maybe noticing me standing there, but he did not stop. None of them did. They just kept coming, one after another, following a route that had been drawn up without me but depended entirely on what I owned. I looked down at the posted sign nailed to the old wooden post near the bridge entrance. Maximum load 12 tons. Black lettering, weathered but clear. Beneath it, the county registration number, still valid, still enforceable. I reached out and brushed my fingers across the surface, feeling the grooves in the paint where time had worn it down. Then I stepped back and let the next truck roll through. Back inside, the readings were starting to tell a different story. 11.2 tons. 11.6. One spike hit 12.1 and held just long enough to register before dropping back down as the truck cleared the far side. I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, watching the graph form in real time, each peak stacking on top of the last like a signature they were leaving without realizing it. This was no longer about one crossing. This was repetition, frequency, sustained stress over hours instead of seconds. And that is where structures fail, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of too much, too often. I opened the file on my laptop and began logging timestamps, matching each spike to the camera footage, building a record that did not need interpretation. Just facts. Wait. Time. Sequence. By the time the sun started to dip, the bridge had carried more load in one day than it had in the past 5 years combined. And still, they kept coming. No hesitation. No adjustment. Just the steady belief that nothing was going to stop them. I glanced once more at the numbers, then at the footage of Linda turning away, already moving on to whatever came next in her plan. That was when I realized something almost reassuring. They were not being careful. They were being consistent. And consistency, when it is built on the wrong assumption, is exactly what turns a small problem into a very expensive one. By the third day, the bridge had stopped sounding like wood and started sounding like math. Every pass translated into numbers before it ever reached my ears, the sensors feeding me clean data that stripped away all guesswork. I woke up before sunrise and checked the overnight logs first, the faint blue glow of the screen lighting up the workshop, while everything outside sat quiet and still. They had started early again. Not one or two trucks this time, but a steady chain that ran like a schedule someone had carefully planned out. 11.8 tons, 12.0, 12.3. That last number held longer than I liked, the kind of hold that tells you the structure is not just carrying weight, it is negotiating with it. I could almost feel the strain through the numbers alone, like pressure building behind something that was never designed to release it. I stepped outside just as the first light broke across the tree line, the air cool and damp, carrying that same mixture of concrete, dust, and diesel that had started to feel permanent. The bridge sat there exactly where it always had, quiet, unremarkable, giving no visible sign of what it had been forced to handle. That is the thing about well-built structures. They do not complain. They absorb. They adapt. Until they cannot. Another truck approached, slower this time. Maybe because the driver was new, or maybe because even he could feel something was different about that crossing. The tires hit the planks, and I heard it again, that deeper tone underneath the surface noise, like tension stretched tight enough to hum. I did not move. I just watched it cross and disappear down the line of fresh dirt they had carved into what used to be untouched ground. Behind me, my phone buzzed softly. Another spike logged. Another entry added. I had stopped thinking in individual moments and started thinking in patterns. Frequency, repetition, cumulative stress. That was where the Real story lived. Around mid-morning, I saw something new. A temporary sign had been added near the road, bright reflective orange with black lettering directing construction traffic straight toward my bridge. No mention of private property. No weight restriction. Just a clean, simple arrow pointing exactly where they wanted everything to go. I walked up to it, ran my fingers along the edge, and felt the cheap plastic flex slightly under pressure. Temporary. Disposable. The kind of sign you put up when you expect something to be there just long enough to get what you need before anyone asks questions. I looked past it toward the bridge, then back at the sign again. That was the moment I understood how they saw this. Not as a violation. Not as a risk. Just as a shortcut. Something convenient. Something that belonged to whoever used it first and hardest. I turned back toward the house and pulled up the county database on my phone, scrolling through the filings I had already reviewed, stopping on the one document that mattered more than any other. The registered load limit. 12 tons. Filed. Approved. Legally binding. And attached to that, a notice requirement that most people never read. Any entity exceeding that limit after being made aware of it assumes full liability for resulting damage. I had sent that notice 2 days ago. Certified. Time-stamped. Delivered. I had the confirmation sitting in my inbox like a quiet piece of insurance they did not know they had already accepted. I closed the file and slipped the phone back into my pocket as another truck rolled past me without slowing, following that bright orange arrow like it was the only thing that mattered. The bridge held. Of course it did. It always had. But holding is not the same as lasting. And lasting is what they were about to run out of. I walked back inside. The hum of the sensors still feeding data into the system, each new entry reinforcing the same conclusion I had reached the night before. They were not just crossing a bridge anymore. They were building a case. And they were doing it perfectly. By the fourth day, they stopped pretending it was temporary. The trucks came earlier, stayed later, and the gaps between them disappeared until the bridge was carrying weight almost constantly, like a conveyor line that never shut off. I could hear it before I even opened my eyes that morning. That distant low-frequency vibration traveling through the ground, subtle but persistent, like something mechanical had taken root where it did not belong. I lay there for a moment, listening, mapping the rhythm in my head, counting seconds between passes without even needing to look at the screen. They had optimized it. That was the only word for it. Whatever hesitation they had at the beginning was gone, replaced by efficiency. That meant confidence. And confidence built on the wrong assumption is the most predictable thing in the world. I stepped into the workshop and checked the overnight log. The graph was no longer a series of peaks. It was a pattern. Repeating, consistent, undeniable. 12.4. 12.6. One spike hit 13.1 and held long enough to flatten the curve before dropping. I stared at that number for a second longer than the rest, then leaned in closer, zooming into the timestamp, cross-checking it with the camera feed. There it was. A fully loaded cement mixer, rear axle lagging just enough at mid-span to concentrate the load exactly where the structure was weakest. Not intentional, just physics. But physics does not need intent to do its job. Outside, the air was warmer now, carrying that same thick scent of wet concrete and heated metal. The bridge looked the same as always, but I could see it if I paid attention. The slight change in alignment along the guardrail, the almost imperceptible dip at the center that had not been there last week. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not enough to trigger concern, but enough for me to measure. I walked underneath it, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth near the creek, and ran my hand along one of the main support beams. The wood was solid, still dry, still holding, but the tension was there, locked in, stored like energy waiting for a release point. I could feel it in the way the grain resisted pressure, in the way the bolts held just a fraction tighter than they should have. I stepped back and looked up through the structure as another truck crossed overhead, the shadow moving across the beams in a slow, heavy sweep. The sound was different now. Not louder, just deeper, more committed, like the bridge had stopped negotiating and started enduring. Back inside, I opened the folder where I had been organizing everything. Footage labeled by time. Load data matched to each crossing. Copies of the notice I had sent, complete with delivery confirmation and signature receipt. I read that last part again, not because I needed to, but because it mattered. They had been informed. Clearly. Officially. There was no ambiguity left in this situation. That was the difference between an accident and accountability. Around noon, Linda's SUV pulled up again. This time she walked closer, stepping onto the gravel just a few yards from where I stood. She glanced at me briefly, a quick acknowledgement, then looked past me toward the bridge like I was just another object in the background. "We are making great progress out here," she said, voice smooth, confident, like she was delivering good news. I did not respond. I just held her gaze for a second longer than expected, then shifted my attention back to the trucks moving behind her. She followed my line of sight, watched one cross, then turned back to me with that same practiced smile. "It is holding up just fine," she added. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. "For now," I said. She gave a small laugh, dismissive, already stepping back toward her vehicle. "You worry too much," she replied, like concern was a flaw instead of a skill. I watched her drive off, the dust settling slowly in her wake, then looked down at my phone as another spike registered on the screen. 13.0. Clean. Recorded. Time stamped. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a slow breath, letting the steady hum of engines and the quiet strain of the bridge blend into one continuous sound. They thought they were building something out there. Roads. Foundations. Value. But every truck that crossed that span was building something else entirely. A record. A pattern. A line they had already crossed and kept crossing again and again. And the thing about lines like that is simple. Once they are documented, they do not disappear. They become evidence. I stopped thinking about stopping them sometime around the 5th day. That idea had already expired, replaced by something quieter and far more effective. I was not trying to interrupt what they were doing anymore. I was letting it complete itself. That morning, the sky sat low and gray over the property, the kind of heavy air that carries sound farther than it should. Every engine, every shift in gears, every slow roll across the bridge felt amplified, like the entire place was tuned to one frequency. I stood at the edge of the creek again, looking up at the underside of the structure while another truck crossed overhead. The load sensors chimed softly through my phone, a clean notification that would mean nothing to anyone else, but read like a warning to me. 13.2 tons. Sustained. Not a spike. Not a fluctuation. A hold. I watched the beam above me as it carried that weight, the fibers in the wood holding their line, resisting just enough to keep everything in place. That was the moment I knew we were past theory. This was no longer about limits on paper. This was reality pushing directly against them. I stepped back out from under the bridge and climbed the bank slowly, brushing dirt from my hands as I reached the top. The trucks did not stop. They never did. One after another, each one adding its own line to the record I had been building. I could feel the pattern in my chest now, the timing of it, the predictability. That was the key. Predictability is what turns behavior into proof. Inside the workshop, the air felt warmer, filled with the faint electrical hum of the monitoring equipment and the soft ticking of the cooling system as it processed everything in real time. I pulled up the full data set, expanding the timeline across the screen until the past several days stretched out in front of me like a map. It was clean. Too clean. The same violation repeated with mechanical precision, documented from multiple angles, backed by certified notice and undeniable measurements. There was no argument left in it. Only outcome. I opened a new folder and began assembling the final structure of the file. Not just logs and footage, but context. The registered specifications. The legal filings. The notice they had received. The timestamps that showed exactly when they crossed the line and how many times they chose to stay there. Each piece fit into place without resistance, like it had been waiting to be assembled. Around mid-afternoon, the pace outside increased again. More trucks. Heavier loads. A push to accelerate whatever timeline they were working under. I stepped out onto the porch and watched as two mixers lined up back to back, engines idling, drivers waiting their turn to cross. The bridge responded the same way it always had. It held. It adapted. It endured. But I could see it now without needing to measure. The center span had settled just enough to change the way light passed underneath it, a subtle shift that most people would miss, but that stood out to me like a marker. That was not failure. That was fatigue. And fatigue, once it sets in, does not reverse. It progresses. Slowly. Quietly. Inevitably. My phone buzzed again. 13.4 tons. The highest yet. I let the number sit on the screen for a second, then locked it and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I did not need to watch every crossing anymore. I already had what I needed. The rest was just confirmation. I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the rough wood under my hands, and looked. Out at the line of trucks stretching back toward the road. Linda's project. Linda's shortcut. Linda's assumption that access meant permission. She thought she was moving fast, that she was staying ahead of any problem that might come up. But she had already passed the point where speed mattered. Because the moment they ignored that posted limit, the moment they chose to keep crossing after being informed, the outcome stopped being uncertain. It just had not arrived yet. And when it did, it was not going to look like something I caused. It was going to look exactly like what it was. The result of a system pushed beyond what it was built to handle, documented every step of the way by the one person who understood exactly where that line was. The morning it happened, everything felt too quiet for what was coming. Not silent, just off. The trucks were still there, engines idling, the low rumble steady as always, but something in the rhythm had shifted. I could hear it before I even checked the readings, that slight hesitation in the sequence, like the system they had built was starting to push against something it did not fully understand. I stepped out onto the porch with my phone already in my hand, the screen lighting up as the sensors fed in another set of numbers. 13.6 tons. Sustained again. Longer this time. I exhaled slowly, watching the bridge as the weight settled into it, the center span dipping just enough to change the angle of the morning light underneath. Not dramatic. Not visible to anyone who was not looking for it. But it was there. And once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. Another truck lined up behind the first, waiting its turn, the driver tapping the brake lightly, inching forward as soon as the path cleared. No pause. No reassessment. Just continuation. That was the pattern now. I walked closer this time, stopping near the base of the bridge as the next truck began its crossing. The sound was different again, deeper, more committed, like the structure had moved past resistance and into acceptance. The sensors chirped. 14.1 tons. That number held. Not a spike. Not a fluctuation. A full, steady load sitting right on top of something that had been clearly defined long before any of this started. I tilted my head slightly, listening to the way the wood carried that weight, the subtle shift in tone as it adjusted, redistributed, held. There is a moment in every structure's life where it stops having margin, where every additional pound is no longer absorbed, but added directly to the total stress. I knew that moment when I saw it, and we were standing right on it. I stepped back without saying a word, giving the truck space to finish its crossing. The driver never looked down, never questioned it. He just followed the path in front of him like he had done all week, trusting that whatever was under those tires would keep doing its job. That trust is what made this possible. Not mine. Theirs. Back inside, the data confirmed everything I had already felt. The curve had changed, not in shape, but in behavior. The recovery between loads was slower now. The baseline was creeping upward, just enough to show that the structure was not fully resetting between crossings. That is how fatigue works. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Until the system is no longer what it was designed to be. I opened the full timeline again, overlaying the last 24 hours against the previous days. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. They had crossed from overuse into overload, and they had done it repeatedly. I leaned back in the chair, letting the hum of the equipment fill the room, steady and controlled, the opposite of what was happening outside. My phone buzzed again. Another crossing. Another entry. 14.0. Clean. Recorded. I did not rush back out this time. I did not need to. The outcome was no longer something I had to anticipate. It was something that had already been set in motion. All that was left was timing. I walked to the window and looked out at the line of trucks still feeding toward the bridge, each one carrying the same assumption forward, each one adding to a total they could not see. Somewhere down that line, Linda's SUV sat parked again, her figure moving between workers, pointing, directing, completely unaware that the system she believed she controlled had already reached a point where control did not matter anymore. I rested my hand against the window frame, feeling the solid, unmoving structure beneath my palm, and watched as another truck began. Its crossing. They thought the bridge was holding, and it was, right up until the moment it would not. And when that moment came, it would not be sudden to me. It would be exactly what the numbers had been saying all along. It did not happen with a crash. That is what most people expect. Something loud. Something sudden. But real structural failure does not announce itself like that. It arrives quietly, in the middle of everything else, when nobody is paying attention to the exact moment the line is crossed. I was already watching when it started. The sensor alert came first, a different tone this time, sharper, longer, holding on the screen just a fraction too long before resolving. 14.3 tons. Sustained. Then the next reading did not drop the way it should have. The baseline stayed elevated. That was the first sign. Not visible, not dramatic, just a number that refused to return to where it belonged. Outside, another truck was already rolling forward, following the same path, the same routine, the same assumption. I stepped off the porch and moved closer, stopping just short of the bridge entrance as the weight settled onto the span again. The sound changed. Not louder, just tighter, like something had run out of space to adjust. I could feel it in the air, that subtle shift where everything becomes less forgiving. The wood did not complain. It held, but it was no longer absorbing. It was carrying everything directly. The sensors chimed again. 14.5. Then it held, longer than anything before it. I watched the center of the bridge, the slight dip now more defined, the alignment just off enough to catch the light at a different angle. Still subtle, still easy to ignore if you did not know what you were looking at. But it was there, and it was not going back. The truck kept moving, slow, steady. The driver focused on the path ahead, unaware of the exact moment he became part of something much larger than a delivery route. As the rear axle reached the midpoint, the tone shifted again. A deeper note, stretched thin, like tension drawn to its limit. I took one step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. This was the point where outcome replaces possibility. The sensors did not spike this time. They plateaued. 14.6. Flat. Sustained. No recovery. No release. Just weight sitting exactly where it should not be. Then it happened. Not a collapse. Not a break. A shift. Small. Controlled. But final. The center span settled just enough that the entire structure realigned under load, redistributing stress in a way it had never been designed to do. You would miss it if you blinked. A fraction of an inch. Maybe two. But that was all it took. Because once a structure moves beyond its intended geometry, everything changes. The load paths shift. The forces multiply in directions they were never meant to handle. And most importantly, it does not go back. The truck cleared the far side, rolling off as if nothing had happened. The next one behind it slowed for the first time all week, the driver hesitating just enough to register that something felt different. I watched him pause, then continue anyway, following the same line like every driver before him. That was the moment the system broke, not physically, but logically. The assumption that everything was fine no longer matched reality. Back inside, the data confirmed it instantly. The recovery line was gone. The baseline had permanently shifted upward. The structure had entered a new state, one where every additional load would compound on top of what was already there. I leaned over the screen, studying the curve as it flattened into something I had only seen in reports, never in real time on my own property. This was not failure yet. This was inevitability. My phone buzzed again. Another truck approaching. Another reading incoming. I straightened up, took a slow breath, and looked back out toward the bridge. They were still coming. Still following the plan. Still trusting something that had already changed in a way they could not see. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stepped outside once more, the air heavy with diesel and concrete, the sound of engines filling the space like nothing had shifted at all. But I knew. The bridge was no longer what it had been yesterday, and neither was the outcome they were heading toward. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees that evening, the bridge was no longer part of their system. It was the weak point inside it. You could feel it in the way everything slowed without anyone saying a word. The trucks still lined up, engines idling, but the spacing between them stretched just a little wider, like instinct was starting to override instruction. I stood at the edge of the gravel again, hands resting loosely at my sides, watching as the next driver approached the entrance. He hesitated. Not long. Just enough to look down at the planks before easing forward. That was new. That was awareness creeping in, late but inevitable. The bridge carried him across, just like it always had, but the movement was different now. Not smooth. Not predictable. A subtle shift in alignment that translated through the entire structure like a quiet warning. He cleared the far side and kept going, but the line behind him did not move as quickly as before. Something had changed, and even without numbers, they could feel it. Back inside, the data told the same story with more precision. The baseline had not dropped once in over an hour. Every new load stacked directly on top of the last, the curve flattening into something that no longer resembled a functioning design. It was not a spike anymore. It was a plateau. Continuous stress with no recovery. I leaned over the screen, tracing the line with my eyes, matching each segment to the footage I already had stored. There was no gap left in it. No room for interpretation. Just a complete, uninterrupted record of a structure being pushed beyond its defined limit after clear notice had been given. That was the moment I stopped collecting. Not because it was over, but because it was complete. Everything after this was just repetition. I closed the file slowly, letting the quiet click of the laptop mark the end of something they did not even know had started. Outside, the activity began to thin. One by one, the trucks pulled back, engines fading as they turned away from the line they had been following all week. No announcement. No explanation. Just a gradual retreat from something they no longer trusted. Linda's SUV was still there at first, parked off to the side, her silhouette visible through the windshield as she sat looking toward the bridge. Not directing. Not moving. Just watching. For the first time, she was not in control of the pace. She was reacting to it. I stepped down from the porch and walked toward the bridge, stopping at the same point I had every day, looking out across the span as it settled into its new state. It held. Of course it did. But it was different now. The geometry had shifted. The margin was gone. It would never be what it was before. And that mattered. Because in the eyes of the law, that change had a cause. Documented. Measured. Time-stamped. I turned back toward the house as the last truck in line pulled away, leaving the air quieter than it had been all week. The smell of concrete lingered, mixed with the fading heat of the engines, but the motion was gone. In its place was something far more permanent. Record. Liability. Consequence. My phone buzzed one final time, The last reading of the day settling onto the screen. 14.2. Still above limit. Still holding. I looked at it for a second, then locked the screen and slipped it into my pocket. They thought they were building faster than anyone could stop them. But they were never ahead. They were just early. Because everything they needed to lose had already been put in place, piece by piece, crossing by crossing, until the outcome was no longer something I had to create. It was something they had already earned.